Hey guys, good to be back with you. I'm Joseph Wall from here in Perkins, Oklahoma. Been farming around this area for about 5 generations, if you could say I've been doing it. But it's good to be here. It's good to be able to talk about farming. It's good to be able to talk about agriculture because agriculture is such a central aspect of civilization. It's such a central aspect of the survival of humanity, really, because we like to eat. We like to have food on the table. It's an important thing for families to be able to eat. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be together and to be able to talk about this concept because it's really one of the most foundational concepts throughout history. If you think all the way back to the very beginning when God created the world, he created a garden where plants existed, where people were placed with the purpose of taking care of plants. And that's really what we want to talk about on this channel. So what we want to talk about is how we can take care of the world that God created and how we can manage the plants that we have the opportunity to work with. And so for a few minutes right now, we want to talk about the core concepts of agriculture, specifically cultivated agriculture, and how we manage them. And there's a triangle of foundational, fundamental characteristics of agriculture. And that's what I want to look at right here. If we think about these three concepts, we have these three core concepts of agriculture. When we go out to plant a field, when we go out to plant a crop, there's three things that we need to keep in mind, and that is the seed factor, the nutritional factor, and the environmental factor. And we're going to use these three foundational factors of agriculture over and over again as we go through how we can do a better job of farming, how we can do a better job of managing plants and growing crops and feeding the people that we interact with. When we think about the seed factor, that's really what we have the most influence over. When we're in our farming enterprises, when we're planting crops, the first thing we have to think about is what are we going to plant? We think about our crop selection. This is the concept of what variety are we going to plant? What type of crop are we going to grow? Let's take examples of like corn or soybeans or wheat. These are things that we grow a lot of here in Oklahoma. And so these are kind of things that examples of what crop selection looks like. This is going to be different for everybody in every situation around the world, but the same core concept exists. We have to decide what we're going to plant. So we have the seed factor. We also have the nutritional factor. This is the food that the plants eat. Just like humans, plants need food. They need things to survive on. They need things to nourish them. And that's where we get the concept of nutrition. The fundamental nutritional factors that we think of, we often call these the macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There's a lot of other nutrient factors that we refer to as micronutrients simply because they are much smaller factors. They're not less important, they're just smaller factors. Less of them is utilized in the process of each plant's growth. And the third primary fundamental factor that we have in growing plants is the environmental factor. And this factor, unfortunately for us, we don't have a lot of control over. There's a few situations where we may have some control over the water in cases of irrigation. Some people have some control over the environmental factor there. Temperature, that pretty much is just a determination by the time of the year. We don't have a lot of control over that. Sunlight, those kind of things are environmental factors that affect the growing of the crop that we are trying to produce. And we don't have a lot of control over that. But what we want to think about and how we can improve our practice in agriculture is the factors that we can control. And thinking about these in order, seed is the primary factor that we can control the easiest and the most economically. Nutrition is something that we have the responsibility to control to a large degree, but it's not going to be as economical to control as the seed factor. So when we're thinking about the seed factor, we're going into a situation where we're about to plant a crop, and we're making that crop selection decision at the beginning of the growing season, we're going to be thinking about these other two factors as well to help us make a wise decision about this factor. If we're in a situation where there is a large environmental factor, such as a shortage of water or an excess of water, that's going to be a factor that helps us determine what is the wisest selection of crop to plant. Maybe we're in a situation where temperature has a large amount of variation, or sunlight is a large factor. There are places in the world where sunlight does not exist for months at a time. In other times of the year, sunlight exists almost the entire day long. And so that is an enormous factor on what crop selection is best fit for that environment. And this is true not only on a massive scale, as we talked about different parts of the world, but also on a micro scale. In our individual situations, there is so much variation in the environmental factor, even within a field. There are areas that remain very dry, and there are also areas that hold water, like low areas, mud holes. And so those factors are going to affect what seed we select. Now, the nutritional factor is also going to come into play as we are making this crop selection decision. If we're in a situation where nitrogen is very highly available and economical, then maybe a crop like corn would be a great one to use, because corn is a very high producing, a very profitable crop. Its downfall is that it uses an enormous amount of nitrogen. And in a lot of cases, nitrogen is very expensive. And so if we're in a case where nitrogen is very readily available, then corn is a great one to use. Now, if we think about something like soybeans, they do not need the application of additional nitrogen because they have the ability within the plant to fix nitrogen out of the environment and put it into the nutritional situation. And so that's a very beneficial thing about soybeans. Wheat is somewhat in between. It doesn't provide nitrogen out of the environment, but it's not quite as high a demanding crop as corn is. And so we're using these other factors to help us determine what seed we are going to select and what crop we are going to plant, what variety we're going to plant, how long of a maturity we want to plant. A lot of different factors to keep in mind there. And this might sound complicated, and to a degree it is, but it's very basic as well. And so we want to get into this more in coming videos to talk about some of the more detailed questions surrounding crop selection. Things like maturity intentions, varieties, yield goals, and environmental factors. A lot more can go into that decision making. But what we want to do is start thinking about that and start thinking about how these factors are affecting us in our varied situations. Now, after this crop selection decision has been made and the seed is planted, it's already in the soil. We can't do anything at that point. And then we need to be thinking about the nutritional factor, because the nutritional factor is the only thing we can control at this point. Once the crop has been selected, the seed is in the ground, and the crop is in the process of growing, we have an ongoing responsibility to manage the nutritional factor for the best possible outcome of this crop. So we're going to think about these core macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are what we call the big three. These are the three that really affect the growth and stability of the plant. There's some other micronutrients that we're going to go into hopefully at some point in the future, but they'd be somewhat distracting at this point. Nitrogen, as we mentioned, is the most important growth nutrient for crops like corn and wheat. It is also critical in soybeans. In fact, soybeans use even more nitrogen. The only difference is they produce it out of the air. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Phosphorus and potassium are not necessarily your growth nutrients, but they are very critical for health and for the overall stability of the plant. And they also affect the mobilization of nitrogen significantly, which is that growth factor. So if we think about these nutritional factors that we have, we think about how this can be applied in a variety of settings, we need to recognize that we're not all going to be in the same scenario. We're not all going to go to the dealership and buy fertilizer and apply. Some of us have that option, some of us do not. And what we need to recognize is when we think about this nutritional factor of growing a crop, we have a lot of options out there. There's a lot of things that can help in this scenario. Chemical fertilizer is a great option. That's the most common throughout the world. When crops are planted, chemical fertilizers are applied, and that does a very good job of providing the nutritional needs of that seed. But there's a lot of other options. We need to think about things like compost and the manure from animals, such as cows or chickens or goats or pigs, anything like that. That manure that comes from those animals is a very balanced combination of these three macronutrients. And it also includes a very large amount of all those other micronutrients. And so when we think about something like manure, it's not the most readily available everywhere in the world. but it is probably the most balanced and the best nutritional addition that you can add to the growth of your soil. And so if you're in a situation where you have that available, maybe you have one cow in the stall, you can collect the manure that comes from that cow and apply it to your plants and receive the nutritional benefit from that. Now, what we want to also point out before we conclude, as we consider these three foundational building blocks of growing a successful crop, is it's not just about more, it's about balance. We want to look at these things and we want to balance them in the most effective way. Just because you have fertilizer doesn't mean you should put more on. Just because you have a seed doesn't mean you should plant more. Just because you have water doesn't mean you should apply more. And so it's a matter of balance. And as we get into these scenarios, we're going to see a different prescription for different situations. And not everyone is going to fall in the same category. Some places we're going to plant a very thick amount of seeds. Some places we're going to plant very few seeds. And that factor alone can have more influence over yield than anything else. Some places we're going to apply more nitrogen, and yet in other situations, if we over-apply nitrogen, we would be a detriment to the crop. Some places we may add water, and other places we may try to take away water. And so all of these factors we want to consider and remember that they are a balancing effect. We are not simply trying to add the maximum, but we are trying to get the very best balance that we can. And so let's think about these concepts and what we want to do as we go into further videos and looking at plants specifically and looking at how they're responding is thinking about these three factors. And we're going to see these play out as we go into all these scenarios and as we look at plants specifically. And when we pull out the problems that our plants are facing, when we pull out the shortfalls that plants are having in their production processes, we want to think about these three factors. And so when we look at a problem in our crops, and maybe it's not producing as well as it could, we want to start by asking these three questions. Where did the problem happen? Was it my seed selection? Was it a nutritional factor? Or was it simply an environmental factor over which I had no control? But over these things that we do have control, and to the extent that we have control over the environment of our crops, we want to do the very best we can. And so I hope that as we go through further videos, and as we look at these things, and as we think about the crops we're growing, we can do a better job, and we can grow our crops to the full potential that God designed them to grow.